Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here again. We were here 2 years ago presenting on a related topic, so we're now presenting more current information and data. And we were hoping Graciela and Alex would go first, so we wouldn't have to
Thank you.
provide so much background, but here we go. So we're looking at this question of the, sorry, I'll move on. The effectiveness of the labor reforms that have taken place in Mexico in both 2017 and 2019, and the labor mechanisms that were attached to the new NAFTA, it's called in Canada the CUSMA, the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, and how effective they've been for promoting the rights of Mexican workers. So overall, what is our takeaway is that overall this has been an essential, really important, both of these together represent essential progress in regulating the labor market in Mexico, delivering real rights to workers for the first time, really, since the imposition of the labor regulation system that has been in place for decades in Mexico. And that the mechanism attached to the CUSMA that I'll describe, the rapid response mechanism, has been highly successful in the 30 cases or so that it's been applied in, but that's a small number of cases compared to the overall size of the Mexican workforce. And so we're not seeing yet major gains for workers in the broader population. So who are we? We are we're our own people, academic labor lawyer. We're both members of the Independent Advisory Committee of a project funded by the federal government that's providing funding to Unifor, which is in turn funding a long-established Mexican advocacy organization for Mexican workers, SILAS. And it's funding a major project to support worker education and worker training and organization in Mexico. So we're very happy to be associated with that project, and we've learned a ton from it, and we really thank Unifor and ESDC for funding that. And Unifor and SILAS for letting us learn from them. So SILAS, amongst other things, has set up a series of worker houses, casas obreras, in 7 cities in Mexico, and especially industrial cities and export-oriented sectors that are organizing and training workers, and has also undertaken a huge research project to look at the effects of that. And so in part, our presentation draws from the research they've been doing. So what has been happening? Basically, all these events are situated within broader political, economic, social contexts. In Mexico, the shift from what Graciela and Kevin Middlebrook described as the institutional stability paradox, where you saw long-standing, decades-long control over workers, preventing authentic organizing practices in Mexico, by unions that were linked to the federal government, the longstanding authoritarian party that ruled Mexico for many decades, and the existence changing over time about the emergence of so-called protection unions. So on the one hand, there's this huge sector dominated by these protection unions and yellow unions, and traditional corporatist sectors, and on the other hand, a very small, brave, struggling independent labor movement that was, its chances were really doomed or really limited by the existence of this institutional stability paradox. But for decades, also on the margins, these activists and labor lawyers in Mexico were pushing for labor reforms, but without success. Then on the other side, we have the United States, the emergence of protectionism, pressure from the US labor movement, and Democrats in Congress that resulted in the new measures that were included in the CUSMA. And pressure on the Mexican state over time before 2017 to reform its labor regulation system in order to enter into the Trans-Pacific Partnership and later the CUSMA. And then things change in both countries with the election of AMLO from Morena, kind of pro-labor party, and in the United States with Biden and his worker-centered trade rules. Canada, I put down on the bottom here, not doing very much, kind of in support of these changes, but doing very little, except funding our project. Thank you, Canada. So I'm not going to go into the details because I don't have time, and you can read about this elsewhere, including in this great work by Graciela and the late lamented Kevin Middlebrook about what happened, what changed with the labor law reforms, which is a domestic process that took place under international pressure, particularly from the United States. But the laws were written by Mexican labor lawyers and activists who knew the system and knew what had to change. Then we get the CUSMA, which includes for the first time a labor chapter that is part of the agreement, not a side agreement like with NAFTA, and it is, in theory, can be supported through claims made in the state-to-state enforcement protocol, Chapter 31. And the funding of all kinds of projects, not just our Canadian projects, but much more money going to the United States from the Labor Department in the US. And because the Democrats feared that that chapter would be insufficient, too slow, too awkward, they also came up with this very innovative mechanism, the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism, which we just briefly describe here. It's rapid, it's effective, and there are strong sanctions attached. And the target of the sanctions is the companies that are violating the workers' rights, not the other state where these violations are taking place. So it's a really innovative, effective mechanism when it's brought to bear. And it has been in a limited number of cases over the last 4 years. So why were these changes taking place? What were their objectives? And here we see there are conflicting objectives, and that helps explain, I think, to some extent, why the results have not been as strong as we might have hoped. Partly it's just like the USTR keeps thinking these labor chapters aren't working. We have to make the mechanism stronger and more effective. One major objective was to reinforce the labor reform that took place domestically in Mexico, but the fear was that the government in power, especially the previous one, would not take these seriously, not change anything. But at the same time, you also see kind of protectionist motivations in the US on the part of Congress and the US labor unions who want to raise Mexican wages, yeah, because it's a good thing, but also because that will disincentivize the movement of jobs to Mexico. So they're kind of mixed motivations here coexisting at the same time. And that plays out in how these mechanisms take effect.
Want me to talk? Okay.
Yeah.
7 or 8 minutes or so? Okay. So this is just quick. Is this where I click? Do this? Oh, you're doing it? Okay. Thanks. Here we go. Quick summary of the different, in the literature, there's 5 years of literature on the rapid response mechanism now. This is a quick sort of summary of the kinds of criteria that people have brought to bear on deciding whether it works or it doesn't, or if it's any good, or we should do it again. There's a review mechanism built into CUSMA, which should really be called CAMU, because I think it's a little bit more existential that way. But we're coming up to the 2025 beginning of the review period, and RRM's part of that review. Anyway, so you can see some of the keywords there that people, academics mainly, but also commentators and dilettantes like myself have used to try and evaluate whether this mechanism has worked or not. And we've already buried the lead and said that it, or no, the opposite of that, and said that it does work. But let me move on quickly to here. First of all, actually, like Laura described it very quickly, and maybe Graciela is going to tell us a bit more about it, but the changes in Mexico are profound, and the system that had to be changed was deep and profound. And it's probably far too early to really come to any even kind of clear initial observations about what that means. But What we did see immediately was in the implementation of the reforms in Mexico, we saw labor violations, violations of freedom of collective bargaining, freedom of association type rights that are within both the reforms and the already existing Mexican labor laws. So those processes threw off a bunch of cases, violations that then come up and get pushed through the rapid response mechanism. And these are sort of typically what we saw in I think there's 28 cases. The most recent one started in September, and they're mostly started by the USTR, the US Trade Representative Office is one, started by the Canadian office, which we helped work on, in fact, which we can talk about. But we didn't want to go through case studies because they don't help us get our point across as much. So if we take the narrowest possible lens, looking at these criteria at what the RRM did in its 5 years of operation, whether we should continue or not, just what happened in the actual cases, what were the outcomes, this is what we see. Roughly 36,000 workers, largely, majority in the auto sector, but starting to spread out into other sectors now that come under the priority sectors, the covered sectors. There's fights about those words. We can get in there, back pay, reinstatements, all the kinds of things you'd like to see in a normal functioning labor relations system happening. I think in 95, I'll say 95%, 28 is just not a big number, but they were worker favorable outcomes, right? So the workers won their cases. The independent union in many cases was established and began collective bargaining, or the remedies were otherwise what they were seeking there. So it did what it was supposed to do as a rapid response mechanism, enforcing rights such as they could be under the trade regime. There's lots of little hiccups in the way that it worked, and there's lots of gaps and ambiguities, but it's a new system. And I mean, it's not even that long. You can read it in 10 minutes before you go to bed. So of course, there's going to be lots of gaps and ambiguities, and those things are going to, whoops, I went the wrong way, didn't I? Thank you. Two notable victories. We can talk about those a little bit more if you're curious. And here's some of the criticisms that come out about it. And they're a little bit criticisms in implementation and then criticisms in structure. The mechanism doesn't reach far enough. It doesn't cover the right sectors. It's a little bit ambiguous in its gaps in implementation and so on and so forth. Its processes are still not really well understood by a number of actors. They tend to be less well understood when you're on the losing side and better understood when you're on the winning side, if you know what I mean. There's a lot of Mexican employer labor lawyers saying, oh, we don't understand why we're doing this. But the structural ones are perhaps more important. The mechanism only applies to violations in Mexico, intentionally drafted and applied that way. It's notionally applicable in Canada and the United States, but functionally not. You can see the footnote that more or less excludes every violation. And it's not like there was an absence of labor relations violations, some of them quite large in the past 5 years in Canada and the United States. It would have been handy to be able to apply it here, but it isn't. So it's kind of imperial in its application so far, and that's one of the first things. And you see that quite consistently in the literature about the design of it. And as Laura's already said, it worked as it was supposed to. It was quite fast for anyone who's like spent time in the labor relations trenches. 132 days is not bad to get to an end result with a company admitting they're guilty and a remediation agreement in there and already done in as little as 81 days. And considering it's a couple of states that have to get involved in doing that through a petition process and everything, that works really well. Interesting has been the already existing labor relations system there, we call them protection unions, company unions, the big federation, CTM, their response to this. I'm curious what Graciela is going to say, but they adapted very quickly to the new labor relations reforms that were happening that this was meant to reinforce. I think Willibaldo has said, one of our colleagues down there has said that about 75 or 80% of the auto sector collective agreements were legitimated under the existing CTM company union and so forth. So they managed to adapt to the process and somehow make it not truly independent or not the outcomes that we would expect to see. I shouldn't judge it, and I'm running out of time. Less than a minute? Okay, great. Oh, well, here we are. Here's a slide giving you a few data points. Anyway, what we tried to do was start in the narrowest and then kind of widen out and see what are some of the social outcomes that we might look for if this thing is working. And the reforms themselves are working, even though, as we've said, it's clearly too soon. There were thought to be around 140,000 existing collective agreements at the time in Mexico when the reforms were implemented and this mechanism becomes available to help enforce the reform processes. And one of those reform processes was every single one of those has to be subject to a ratification vote. You know, free, fair election, independently monitored, labor inspectors on the ground to see if it's truly the union that the workers voted for and truly the contract that they want. Over 30,000 maybe went through that process. I would have to say the vast majority, according to our colleagues on the ground working for independent trade unions and organizers there, were not good processes, not free or fair processes. They were the process, you know, there's 1,500 workers at a plant. There were 200 that voted. Some people found out that there was a union a couple of weeks later, kind of thing. So there's very traditional problems in the Mexican system. And they continued even under that. But it also meant that 100,000 of those expired pretty much immediately at the end of this process, which throws up a whole bunch of interesting questions about organizing and about the actual effect of implementing these reforms in the way that they were implemented. And we're having debates about that as we go along. I wish I had, there's 0 minutes, so I wish I had more time. And I won't talk about it except to flip to the last one. I think maybe the last comment, one comment. The rapid response mechanism worked. There's super important and long-awaited labor law reform system happening in Mexico. It's still largely plant-by-plant bargaining. And if there's a conversation we've been having at this conference and pretty much every other labor conference I've been to in the past 10 years, is that that system isn't working anymore in the way that it was designed to when it was brought in 100 years ago. So why would we expect even a functioning rapid response mechanism to have the positive labor outcomes that we're looking for, greater density, higher average wages across sectors, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, if there were to be a conversation about these things, we'd have to say, well, what are we talking about as reforms to the labor relations systems in Canada and in the United States, and of course, hopefully in Mexico, and our colleagues in independent trade unions say this to us as well. It's like, yeah, we don't have the capacity to organize plant by plant. Nobody does anymore. We have to find a different way to do this. So that's, I guess, our ending comment. Thank you for your indulgence.